Well, hello people, welcome back to 90 and Out. I'm Timothy Holt, and let's build some Legos and talk about biblical literacy, shall we? This particular live stream is going to be covering biblical literacy, what that means, and why it's important for any and all Christians to develop some biblical literacy. We'll get right into it, shall we? From time to time, I'm going to be looking to my left because that's where my monitor screen is off to my left. So if you have a comment or anything along those lines, let me know. I will attempt to look at that periodically. So let's get right to it, shall we? Before getting started, we're also going to lead off in prayer. Typically, in the past, I've done prayer not on camera. So you always want to pray before reading the scriptures. That's it. So, God, you're awesome. You are wondrous and holy in all your ways. Thank you for this unique collection of writings known as the Bible. Let us open our ears, open our minds, and see what you have for us today. Amen. Spurgeon wrote this in How to Read the Bible, instructions on, how to read the Bible. He who never quotes will never be quoted, and he who does not read is very likely not to be read. And that is quite true. I don't want you to take my word for anything Scripture has to say. Fact check me all day long, every day. Read the text for yourselves, whether that is multiple English translations or your native tongue, native language, or that is going straight to the source materials and all the ancient copies we have in the original languages of Hebrew, Babylonian, and Koine Greek. So, biblical literacy, what is it? How is it different than other basic literacy, like how to read? The answer to that question is pretty simple. Biblical literacy refers to the Bible and being able to read it and understand it within its proper context. So the methodology of literacy can be used for biblical literacy, and quite frankly should be. So in the same way that you read, say, Harry Potter in its proper context, you should read the scriptures, the Bible, in their proper context. In the same way that you read, say, the New York Times in its proper context, you should read whatever book in the Bible you're reading in its proper context. I know that sounds super basic and elementary, but we have to start with the basics, because let's be honest, you don't have to search very far online or, well, quite frankly, pick your local church to find someone not doing that, right? It's very easy to do. It's super easy to take text out of context. We see this all the time in the news, right? And that is not what proper biblical literacy entails. Biblical literacy is firmly planted on the idea that the text says what it says and can be understood in its proper context. And not only can be, but should be. Okay. The Merriam-Webster's dictionary, Merriam-Webster dictionary, records defines the word biblical as pertaining to the Christian Bible. In our context, in this context, I am specifically referring to the Protestant Bible. It's 66 books and letters. I am not referring to the Coptics, Eastern Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, or I think the Russian Orthodox also have a larger canon. Those organizations have more texts in their Bibles. The reason I'm referring to the Protestant canon specifically is because all mainstream Christian groups and most heretical groups agree on the 66 books of the Bible as being authoritative books of the Bible. Okay? Where they disagree is all the extra texts. So, for my purposes, I'm going to stick with the Protestant canon because that's what everybody agrees to. Now, with that being said, about the Protestant canon, that does not inherently make me Protestant. It just simply means that if I'm going to be discussing biblical literacy as a general concept, it's good to start with a baseline. And the Protestant canon is a good baseline because the Protestant Bible is part of all of the other groups' Bibles. So let's start with there. Okay. Literacy is defined by Merriam-Webster as the ability to read and write and possess knowledge in a particular field or competency. To be able to read and understand what is being read. So combining the two, biblical literacy would be being able to read the Bible and understand what it says. Pretty simple, right? As a result of that, it doesn't take one very long to find somebody not doing that. So we want to do that. And why is biblical literacy so important? And I wouldn't just say so important. I would say it is the most important element of reading the Bible is possessing basic biblical literacy. It's not just one of, it is the most important ability when reading the Bible. Well, it's quite simple. It's because the Bible is not just basic instructions before leaving Earth. Bible. Yes, there are instructions in the Bible. They are prescriptive texts. But there's substantially more descriptive texts than prescriptive texts. So, being able to identify the difference is very important. For example, obvious example of descriptive text, the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, whether you're looking in Exodus 20 or you're looking in Deuteronomy, they are explicitly prescriptive, saying you should do these things, right? Or should not do these things. The first 4 are do's, the last 6 are do nots. All right, so it's more than just description, right? Now, or prescription. So that's a famous section of prescription. The Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew 5 through 8, is prescriptive. Jesus of Nazareth is telling his audience to do things, right? Descriptive, however, would be like in Samuel, no, is it Samuel? I think it's Chronicles. Chronicles has Nathan going to David and telling him a story about a guy who steals a sheep from his neighbor, okay? Right before this, David goes to one of his best friends' house and essentially commits an adultery with his wife. Her name's Bathsheba. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail because it's pretty R-rated. All right, but needless to say, the two of them have an affair. She gets pregnant, and through the course of events, David has one of his friends knocked off, killed, right? Named Uriah. Okay, named Uriah. Clearly, this is a descriptive passage, right? The Bible is not prescribing us to follow David's example in, having an affair with one of our best friends' wives, and then having that said friend, killed off. That's descriptive, not prescriptive. What's up, little man? Right? That is overtly descriptive, not prescriptive. However, in some texts, it's less obvious. And proper biblical literacy, you can't go there. There's a table in the way. Okay? Thank you. Proper biblical literacy is being able to identify the difference, even when it is relatively difficult to do. So, clearly an important skill. Now, let's talk about what is the Bible. Is the Bible one book? No. The Bible is not one book. The Bible is 66 books and writings written by 40 plus known authors over 1,400 years of history in two major sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Clearly not one book. So, if somebody says, hey, the Bible is one book, hopefully they're simply referring to them being bound together and just using a generic term of book, like a volume, and not actually literally speaking it's one continuous book, because it's not. The Bible is not separated or arranged in an order that works well for reading from front to back. If you're reading, say, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, you're going to most likely start with the very first page and then read all the way through. Well, since the Bible is not one book, it is 66 books and writings, I'd recommend doing that with each book. So pick up, say, Mark, the Gospel of Jesus Christ according to Mark, and read it from the beginning to the end. Right? Read it from beginning to end. It's much more difficult to take the text out of context if you do that. So taking text out of context leaves a con. And it's much more difficult to do that when you're reading it straight through, because the author, the human who wrote that book, or humans that wrote that book, wrote it from front to back, right? There it is. So we should read, biblical literacy says we should read the book as it was intended to be read by its original author. And that would be from beginning to end. Just looking at my notes. So how is the Bible structured then if it's not in chronological order, or an order that is conducive to reading from front to back? Well, the Torah, the first 5 books, cover prehistory up to Joseph and his family going into Egypt. And then that's Genesis. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy cover mostly the life of a guy named Moses and those same people, now known as Hebrews, coming out of Egypt and settling in Canaan, modern-day Levant, the Generally modern day Israel, but not entirely the same borders, but similar. But similar borders. And then you have, so those 5 books are called the Torah, or the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. And then the next section is the Old Testament histories. It is pretty lengthy. It covers from the leadership of Joshua through Queen Esther, which timeline-wise is going to cover from about 1100 BC to about 500 BC, which is a pretty long period of time. We have the rise of the judges, we have the monarchs, the Davidic line, we have the divided kingdom, and ultimately the diaspora, or the taking away, which is when both Judah and Israel are conquered by the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Medes. And the Medes. That's histories. Okay. The next section is the poetry and writings. The Old Testament poetry is Job through Ecclesiastes. Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Excuse me. And they are poems, massive poems. You've got Psalms, which is the biggest, Proverbs, which is a bunch of short sayings, Job, which is a pretty cool book. It's a pretty intense book, but it's a pretty cool book. And then you have the next section is usually split into 2 smaller sections, which is going to be the major prophets and the minor prophets. The major prophets simply wrote more. Their writings are longer. And then the minor prophets, their writings are shorter. The minor prophets are also collected in what's called the Book of 12, because there's 12 of them. With that being said, the prophets and the poetry are written during the time of the history books. Okay? So just keep that in mind when you're reading those. The entire Old Testament is written between around 1200 BC and around 500 BC. That 700-ish year period, about 800 year period. The entire Old Testament's written. Then there's about 400 years, 400 to 500 years, depending on your dating, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The entire New Testament's written over about a 100-year period. So it's much more condensed. 2 of them are eyewitnesses. That would be Matthew and John. And then we have 2 second-hand historians that are writing about 30 years after the fact. Okay. And that would be Mark and Luke. Keep in mind, in the Old Testament Mosaic Law, or the Torah, it says that no accusation can be founded without at least 2 witnesses. It says 2 or 3 witnesses. And in the New Testament, we have 2 eyewitness accounts, Matthew and John. We also have 2 other second-hand historians, Luke and Mark. That's something that should be taken into account. They claim to be what they are. Like Luke literally says, I interviewed witnesses and am writing this biography. So, based on those accounts. So it's really hard to say, oh, he claims he was an eyewitness. No, he doesn't. He starts out right in the beginning that he's not an eyewitness. But he's recording them in the Greco-Roman historian fashion. And he has an insane attention to detail. Next is a history book, and that is Acts of the Apostles, also written by Luke. Both of these are written to a guy named Theophilus as a part 1, part 2, right? And then we have a group of letters. They are known as the Pauline letters because they are written or are associated with the Apostle Paul. There's several of them. They're broken down into 2 other sections. One of those sections is the church letters or general letters. You might hear someone say epistle. Epistle simply means letter, by the way. So you have that, right? And then you have the other letters, and the other letters are general church letters. So you have the general church letters written by Paul and company. They're not written exclusively by Paul. He spearheaded the effort, so he gets mostly the credit. And then you have the personal letters that Paul writes to individuals, like the 2 letters to a guy named Timothy. Then after that come the general pastoral letters. And these are written by, the general pastors, right? You've got Mark, or you've got the ones by Peter, James, and John. And a guy named Jude. And then the last book of the New Testament is Revelation. Revelation's written by John. Yeah, same John. And Revelation is what's a good way of putting this? It's a book that gets a lot of credit and misrepresented a lot. Okay? How do you read the Bible? I mean, you might be asking that question right now if you're this far along in the stream. You might be asking that very question right now. How do you read this massive volume for yourself? Well, there's all kinds of reading plans out there. All kinds of them. But I'm going to start with a pretty easy one, all right? First thing is, I don't recommend going to most social media, this site included, all right? I recommend getting a physical copy of a Bible. Like this one, for example, is pretty cool, right? I have an entire shelf of Bibles here. This isn't even all the Bibles I have. Yeah, but get yourself a physical copy. Yes, being on your phone is fine. All right, it's nice, it's convenient. You can even get daily push notifications from different Bible apps. But the thing about this is not exclusively a Bible. So how easy is it to get distracted, right? You get a notification of a message, a DM or whatever, right? Or a game on your phone, right? And all of a sudden you're distracted. It's much more difficult to get distracted with a physical copy. Also, a physical copy doesn't change. Let me repeat that. A physical copy does not change. Digital copies, the source code can change. A physical printing, like this one, isn't going to change unless I physically write in it and change it, right? By the way, I've had this Bible for, I think, like 15 years, something like that, 15 to 20 years. Well, I can tell you, I did not get it in 1993, but it was printed in 1993. Okay, this was given to me in the early 2000s, so 20 years, and the text is still the same, right? Digital copy, not so much. No, that's not the one I want. This one is. This one was a gift recently from one of my sons. He was cleaning out a house and found it. By the way, if anybody knows a Laura May Lyon, let me know. Get a hold of me. I'd love to give this back to her. It's got a personal note in it. And this particular Bible is from 1953. And guess what? The text is still the same text. That's the amazing thing about hard copies, prints. Now get yourself a printed copy. Then what I would recommend if you're brand new to the Bible, it's very simple. I would open up the Bible, find the contents, the table of contents in the front, and go to the Gospel according to Mark. It might even be listed as just Mark. Okay? Okay. All right, so go to the Gospel according to Mark, or just Mark, and then read it straight through. That's it. Read it straight through. Okay, start there. Mark shows Jesus of Nazareth as God in every single chapter. It is the easiest to read as far as reading level is concerned. It's written in the lowest level language of the 4 biographies. It contains all of the core theological statements of faith for a Christian. It is the shortest of the biographies by far. Like, it's considerably the shortest. It's the most action-packed. It reads like an action-adventure novel. So do that, okay? Read Mark. Read Mark first. Read it straight through. You might be able to read it in one session, or maybe over the course of a week, because it's not super long. It's 16 chapters. They're relatively short. It kind of reminds me of those chapter books that you read in like 4th or 5th grade, right? It's that kind of book. So read Mark. Read it over the course of either one sitting or about a week. Read it straight through, okay? Next, after you're done reading Mark, I would turn to 1st and 2nd Timothy. Read those straight through. Super easy to read, but more important than them being easy to read, they are personal letters written by Paul to a young pastor named Timothy. They are great. At one point in time, I had both of these letters completely memorized. I don't anymore, because that's how time works as you get older. But at one point in time I did, and I would highly recommend reading Mark that way, okay? Read 1st and 2nd Timothy. Then I would recommend continuing right into Titus. Those 3 books are right next to each other in most printings of the Bible. So go right into Titus. They're super short. Titus, I think, is 1 chapter. No, I think it's 4 chapters. It's super short. But it's also a personal letter to a young man named Titus from Timothy. Read those, okay? After you read Titus, go ahead and read 1st and 2nd, 3rd John. Again, they're back to back. 2nd and 3rd John are 1 chapter each, and they are general letters written to Christians, just in general, Christians, right? After you read 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, again, 1st Timothy you can read in one setting, 2nd Timothy you can read in one setting, Titus you can absolutely read in one setting. All 3 Johns, the 1st John is a few chapters, but you should be able to get through all 3 of them in one setting, not an issue. And then the last book in this particular section I would recommend reading is going to the Old Testament, and that is the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is a love story that takes place during the Judges, the period of the Judges in the Old Testament. We're talking about 800 to 900 BC, but it sets the groundwork for all kinds of things later. It's 4 chapters long. It is a beautiful love story about how Ruth, who the book's named after, becomes part of the royal dynasty by marrying a guy named Boaz, and how that happens. If you like romance, if you like just a what's going to happen next kind of story, it's really well put together. And it's just a fun read. So it's here because it's a fun read. Okay. I actually recommend reading the book of Ruth multiple times. It's also one of those books at one point in time I had memorized because, again, it's just a fun read. Okay. It's a very enjoyable book to read. Now, enough gushing about Ruth. All right. The next section is going to take place over about 5 months, and that is reading Psalms and Proverbs. So read one psalm every day for 5 months. You'll get through the entire book. 150 psalms, and 5 months is approximately 150 days. So you're going to start with Psalm 1 and read through Psalm 150. The reason Psalms works well for this is because Psalms are individual songs. They're meant to be sung, and they cover the entire BC era of the Jewish people. Okay, when they're called Hebrews, when they're called Israelites, when they're called Jews, the whole time period. There are Psalms. They're separated into 5 books, and they're songbooks, and they're based on time period or genre. So, like, one book is all written by a guy named David, okay, for example. Definitely enjoy the Psalms. People still sing them today, which is pretty cool. While you're doing that, as a new, as being new to reading the Bible, right? I would also recommend reading one chapter from Proverbs every day. However, Proverbs is 31 chapters, so you should ideally read through the entire book 5 times during this process. It is short sayings. Proverbs are short, wise sayings, so it's super easy to read through, and but it's more difficult to get all of what the book has to offer, right? It's wisdom on life. The first 29 chapters are dad's advice to his son, and the rest of the other 2 chapters, one is a guy just giving general advice, and then chapter 31 is a mom's advice to her son. So if it's the 5th day of the month, read Proverbs 5. If it's the 28th day of the month, read Proverbs 28. Okay? Pretty straightforward. So far, should be about 6 to 7 months in, depending on your reading speed and skill level. Should be about 6 to 7 months in to this 2-year reading plan. All right. Now, after reading the 5 months of reading through Psalms and Proverbs, I recommend reading Luke and Acts. This is, as I mentioned before, is a part 1, part 2, Luke and Acts. The Gospel according to Luke, and then the Acts of the Apostles. Luke covers the biography of Jesus in the first one, and then part 2 is after the death and resurrection of Jesus. What happens next? And it chronicles about a 25 to 30 year period, depending on where your dating goes. All right, how dating goes, but it chronicles those events with the first half focusing on, focusing on the disciples in Jerusalem and various other areas, but then about halfway through the book, it focuses more on Paul, and that's because Luke was a traveling evangelist with Paul. So it makes sense that Luke would focus on Paul and what Paul is doing, because he was a eyewitness to those events. Right? So once you're done reading Luke and Acts, Excuse me. All right. Once you're done reading Luke and Acts, then I would recommend going back to the Old Testament. I understand we haven't spent much time at all in the Old Testament so far in this reading plan. That is intentional. Excuse me. The Old Testament is more difficult to read as a whole. Okay? So, excuse me. Now I would recommend reading the Torah, or some people call it the Pentateuch. It's the first 5 books in the Bible. Start with Genesis, read through Deuteronomy. And I'd recommend just reading straight through each of those 5 books. Read straight through each one of those in their entirety. This is not a Bible study plan. This is a Bible reading plan. Read these books like you would read any other book. Just start at the very beginning and read it straight through. Ignore, for the most part, ignore the verse breaks and the chapter breaks. So if you get a copy, I don't know if I have one on my shelf here. I don't. But if you pick yourself up a Bible copy that's in paragraph form, that would be ideal in this case, because you're simply reading through them. You're not studying. Okay? There's time for deep study later. Right now, it's an overview reading the book. Okay? So, read Genesis through Deuteronomy. It's also known as the Torah. Those 5 books are collectively known as the Torah. So, you want to read those. And then, as soon as you're done with those, read the history books. Joshua through Esther. Skip 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Okay. The reason is because 1st and 2nd Chronicles cover the same time period and events as Samuel and Kings. Okay. You can go back and read those later, but right now just skip them, simply to keep the timeline continuity. Okay. After reading the history books, except 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Also, when you're reading the history books, when you get to done with Judges, read Ruth again. That's because Ruth is just a really cool short book. Okay, so Judges, read Ruth, then 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, then Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Okay. When you finish Esther, read the rest of the Old Testament poetry, and it's going to be right in order: Job, Songs of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. This is going to give a great overview of what is going on in history and in that part of the world, but also just like theology stuff too. All right. Lastly, when you're done with those history books, then I would recommend reading 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as well as the rest of the New Testament. Excuse me, with the exception of Revelation. Okay? So, once you've read Esther, go ahead and either read the poetry or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then read the rest of the New Testament that you haven't read. So that would be Matthew and John. Then read all of the Paul's letters that you haven't read. That would be Romans, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, all of those, right? And overall, this should take about 2 years, depending on how quick you are at reading. You can do it in 1 to 2 years. I wouldn't recommend doing it in 1 year. I'd recommend doing it more in 2 years, simply because it's a lot of reading. But if you're one of those, gung-ho readers, by all means, read it in 1 year so far. Now, if you've noticed, I haven't recommended reading any of the Old Testament prophets or the book of Revelation in the New Testament. That is intentional. These books have the highest reading comprehension levels of the entire Bible. Okay? And I'm approaching this reading plan from the understanding that the individual is brand new to reading the Bible. Right? And if you're brand new to reading the Bible, you don't want to start with the most complicated, highest reading difficulty, right? That would not be a good idea. So don't do that, right? You can read Revelation and the Old Testament prophets at your leisure when you're comfortable. Okay? That's it. Read it at your leisure when you're comfortable. But I would recommend not reading them before going through this kind of plan or something similar to this plan. Simply because they have the highest reading difficulty, reading comprehension difficulty. That's all. It's not because they're not important or valuable or contain great theology. It's because they're written in a much more difficult reading level. At the end of the day, the best Bible is the one that you actually read. I cannot stress that enough. The best Bible is the one that you actually read. Okay, not one that someone else reads, but one you read yourself. Okay, because if you're not reading it for yourself, I could tell you whatever I want and claim it's in the Bible, and it might not actually be there. Or I can take this passage or that passage grossly out of context and have it mean whatever I want. All right? Again, you wouldn't be the wiser if you don't know what it actually says, right? And if you don't think people do this, guess what? People definitely do that. Right? People definitely use the Bible to say whatever they want it to say for whatever they want. You don't have to go very far to find that out. Jehovah's Witness, Muslims, Muslims do that a lot. Jehovah's Witness, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons, progressive Christians. There's all. The list is a mile long. By the way, Protestants are not exempt either. Catholics are not exempt. Human beings have been doing it for 2,000 years, right? So, the best thing to do is read it for yourself. Pretty simple. That's pretty cool. All right. So. Tyrannosaurus Rex, right there. That looks pretty cool. It's got an articulating tail. Head kind of goes up and down, but doesn't really come down that far. The legs definitely move, which is kind of neat. We got claws all over the place. Little short hands. Yeah, that's a pretty cool build. I can see why this is the main build of this set. It uses the most pieces. Overall, I like the pterodactyl the best, though, as far as playability is concerned. But I'm going to leave you guys with this and close out this video. One, thank you. If you like this content, do all the social media stuff. If you don't, then, don't do all the social media stuff. I just realized I forgot to put two pieces on the foot here. Take care of that right now. And I'm going to leave you with a quote from Deuteronomy. All right. If you're wondering where I get the biblical literacy is very important thing from, it's it's the Bible. So here it is. It's Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 18 through 21. I'm going to be reading in the New King James Version. Therefore you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and bind them as a sign on your hand. And they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, like the days of the heavens above the earth. Again, don't take my word for anything Scripture has to say. Pick it up, read it for yourself. I'm Timothy Holt with 90 and Out. If you don't have a local church, find one that teaches and reads the Bible, and join it. Online content is nice, but it is no substitute for in-person discipleship and evangelism. May God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. I'm Timothy Holt, and this is 90 and Out.